Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final event for Children's Mental Health Acceptance, for May, and we are ending with a bang. We are doing an amazing panel today. We're going to be talking with folks who, through their own experiences, are going to explore the concepts of awareness, acceptance, social justice, relational health, and anything else that comes up as a part of this conversation. Anytime we get families together, the conversations go where they go, and they flow in an amazing direction. Now, our panelists, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves in a few moments. You are going to learn that three of our panelists are parents. All of our panelists are parents. Three of our panelists are parents of children who have experienced mental health challenges. One of our panelists is going to give you a powerful illustration of acceptance and an unconventional definition of family. So I think this is going to be very exciting. When we speak of children, just so we are all on the same page, we are not talking about the legalistic definition of children. We are talking about the relational definition of children. As you know, the Federation believes that our children are always our children. So when you hear us talking, you will hear some panelists whose children are adults, still speaking of them as children, and that's because this is part of our value system. So what I would love to do, we are sponsored today generously by CareSource. I'm going to ask Josh Boynton, who is the Vice President with CareSource, simply to make some opening remarks, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Lynda. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all. It's really a privilege to stand with you today in recognition of Children's Mental Health Awareness Week. It's also a distinct privilege to be a part of this critical dialogue, the dialogue about the importance of children's mental health in an effort to foster acceptance and prejudice and discrimination. I'm also proud to be a board member here with the National Federation of Families, an organization that, in my opinion, is second to none. Lynda runs just an amazing team and organization, and I'm so proud to be affiliated. As Lynda said, CareSource is a national nonprofit. We're a managed care organization. We've been around for 30 years. And we're proud to work with the National Federation of Families. As a managed care company, we strongly believe that the solutions are most often in our members, in the families and the communities where our members live. And the National Federation of Families is a remarkable example of just that. As a managed care organization, we see our role as a convener, shifting the power from the system to the person, and opportunities like this panel today are invaluable. And we're so appreciative for the opportunity to sponsor, and more importantly, to be a part of this important conversation. So thank you, Lynda. Thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you all for taking the time. We're excited for what's about to happen.
Thank you, Josh, so much, and we are so appreciative of CareSource's sponsorship and support in the work that we are doing on behalf of families. I'm looking at the folks who are joining us, and we've got folks from all over the country. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so glad you could be with us. You will be able to put questions in the chat, and we will do our best to get to those. But right now, I want us to get started, and I'm going to call on our panelists and ask each to please introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what brings them to this work. And Lynda, I will start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lynda Henderson Smith. I am a licensed professional counselor and educational psychologist by training, but for today's conversation, I'm a parent. I'm a parent of an 18-year-old son who has experienced mental health challenges since the age of 8. And I'm here to really have real conversation about what that feels like as a parent, what he's experienced, and am super excited to jump in today, Lynda.
Great. Senator Deeds, welcome. Would you please introduce yourself?
Oh, well, my name's Creed Deeds. I'm a member of the General Assembly in Virginia. I live in Charlottesville. Important to this conversation, I'm father of four beautiful children. My son experienced mental health crisis the last few years of his life, and we can talk about that when the time comes up.
Great. Kate, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Kate Guinness. I am a public health social worker who did clinical work for a long time, and now I have the great privilege actually of doing policy work. And I am also a parent of 2 young adults, one of whom has mental health issues and also interacted with the special education system for her whole young educational career that I'll talk a little bit about. And so I am coming to this work as a policymaker, as an advocate, and as a mom.
And Josh, you have an unconventional story about family. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I'd be glad to. Thanks, Lynda. So Josh Boynton, Senior Vice President with CareSource, but I also come to this conversation as an advocate. I've got 2 children, adult children myself, but really got into this field, going on about 30 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been so long. New Hampshire was the first state in the country to close its state institution for people with disabilities, the Laconia State School, and I was graduating with my undergrad in Keene, New Hampshire, and met a young man who had been institutionalized, and the system was looking for a place for Ron to live in the community. I had grown up doing direct support and being, an advocate for people with disabilities. Met Ron and instantly fell in love with Ron and his family. And, I'll make a very long story short. Ron moved into our home and lived with us for about 12 years. Ron is somebody who is nonverbal in the traditional sense of the word, although communicates quite effectively. His entire, childhood and young adult life was behind the walls of the Laconia State School, and isolated and marginalized, segregated, and used behaviors quite effectively to communicate sometimes aggressive behaviors. And when Ron moved into our home, it was part of a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant on self-determination. The experience allowed us to do some demonstration projects in the state, and one of them was, how are we going to support Ron in the community? How are we going to support Ron as a human being in the community? And so we created an organization called LifeShare, and that organization was built for Ron. And Ron would put together these magnificent colors. He would spend hours and hours putting together these just beautiful, sort of pieces. When he was having a good day, they were, multicolored and they were vibrant. And when he was having a bad day, they were muted and they were dark, and he was communicating through his art, and quickly realized that Ron is an artist. And so when we were putting together some supports and how Ron was going to spend his day in a meaningful way, we put an ad in the local paper and said, artist looking for a fellow artist to support him. We didn't say anything about disability or his mental health challenges. We said, how are we going to support Ron as an artist, as a human being? And Ron hired an artist to support him, and together they built an art co-op in this little college town, Henniker, New Hampshire, the only Henniker on earth, believe it or not. And all of a sudden, the behaviors that Ron was using to communicate, the aggressive behaviors, hitting and kicking and spitting and being aggressive towards other people, started to go away, because he was a part of a community for the first time in his life. People were seeing him as a person, as an artist, as a friend, as a neighbor. And over the years, that model caught on, right? It's real life for real people, and LifeShare grew over 25 years. We supported thousands of individuals across the country. No bricks and mortar, no group homes, no sheltered workshops. It was all community based. And the bottom line is that when we talk about acceptance, seeing Ron as a person for who he truly is, his heart, his soul, what drives him, the impact it had not only on Ron, but on those that know Ron is immeasurable. And Ron continues to be an artist today. He continues to live with his sister. I'm just really, really proud of him and the work that his circle of supports continue to do each and every day. So as Lynda said, family isn't always blood. I'm just really, really happy to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Josh. I wanted to start us off with an amazing example of moving from awareness about Ron to acceptance of Ron and the difference that made in his life. And we're going to have more examples like that as we go through. So I'm going to start out, Lynda and Kate, I know you both have kiddos in school, and I can remember when my son was in school. And I would love for you to give us some examples of their school careers, times when, regardless of their behavioral health challenges, they were fully accepted. And then examples of times when they were not, when there were issues of prejudice and discrimination. Kate, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So let's see. I just have to think about how best to start. So my elder child, who now is about to be 23 in a couple months, which is a little hard to believe. I always say, right, we don't age, but our kids somehow get older. I just as a little bit of background, right? So my whole career, I have been doing kids' mental health work and kids' behavioral health work. So before I was a parent, I was a clinical social worker. I was working with kids and their families. I was doing assessments in the emergency room. I love working with kids. I like to say I've worked with kids since I was a kid, really. And so, I had my first kid, and starting when she was relatively young, I was like, something's going on. There is something going on. And so I went to our local public schools and I said, hey, something's going on. And they said, nah, nothing's going on. And I said, well, I might beg to differ. I might think something's going on. So they, did what they do. And they said, no, nothing to see here. Right. And so she started kindergarten. And about halfway through her kindergarten year, the teacher very, how do I say this? Very tentatively, that's the word I was looking for, tentatively says, so I should back up and say, she went to an inclusion model public school, and we have school choice here where we live. And she went to that school because I chose that school because I knew, even though they said there was nothing going on, I knew there was something going on, right? Because and I'm so delighted to see how many folks are here. As we know, like, parents are the experts in their kids. A lot of us have other kinds of expertise. Parents are the experts in their kids. And so the teacher tentatively came to me and she said, we have a lot of specialists who come in and, they've been watching and, and they said, we're wondering if we could do some testing. And it makes them nervous. It makes them nervous because of stigma. It makes them nervous because they don't know how families are going to respond. They don't know whether I'm going to respond and be angry because you're saying there might be something up with my kid. But what did I say? I said, thank you. I said this 2 years ago and nobody would respond. And so, from the beginning, partly because we're in an inclusion model school where there were special educators and non-special educators in every classroom in that elementary school, we had this collaborative relationship with the educational system that really set us on this path where I said, sure, please. And they said, great, here, right? And I had so many, as a professional person, I had so many kids come into the emergency room, which is where I worked. And they were in the emergency room really because they were in educational settings where they weren't getting what they needed. And someone said, they're misbehaving. They're not misbehaving. They're just behaving. You're not doing what they need, right? And so to have that as my professional experience, and then to have my kid in this place where she was getting her needs met. Now, my kid is female. She's white. She's real smart and quite verbal. She was responded to, and she's real cute, right? And so there were things about her that I know also made it so that people wanted to give her help. Which, if she looked different, if she spoke a different language, if she were a different gender, if she were a person of a different race or a different ethnicity, like, she might not have gotten all of the things that she got. But we had this partnership with the school, which always then allowed me to push when I needed to push. She does have an advocate mama, right? So when I needed to push, I could push, but it was extraordinary. And I sort of have always held these realities of the kids with whom I worked when I was doing clinical work, which I did for 20 years, and my own personal experience. And I thought, how do we get all the kids, right? How do I use my position of privilege and power, frankly, to have more of the kids have this experience instead of the experience that they're having? And so as I have, and I can talk a little more later, but as I have moved out of clinical work and into advocacy work, and then into policy work at the state level and now at the federal level, my world is about trying to make all of the kids have that experience where they're getting what they need, right? So, and where people are listening to the moms and the dads and the foster families and the grandparents, and right, and making sure that kids get what they need. So I'll stop there. I'll pass it on to Lynda.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, so my experience was a little different, right? So my oldest, I forgot to mention, I actually have 3 children. But my oldest child, who's now just finished up his first year of college, when he was younger, didn't necessarily have that same experience. So let's just kind of go back, right, to, I want to say around 3rd grade. We went to this really great, or so I had heard, charter school, where the academics was amazing, right? And it was, but the social climate wasn't necessarily that. And so my son had experienced a lot of bullying, had communicated that to teachers, had communicated, right? I had advocated all the way up to the headmaster of the school, like, hey, we need to have a conversation. We need to do something. And of course they didn't. And so there was a situation that happened where, being bullied, my son decided that since you guys won't protect me, I'll protect myself. And he got into a fight. And he said when he was getting in trouble, I hate it here. I would rather blow up this school than come back here and have to deal with these people. To which the immediate response was to call 911, have the district-wide school social worker come, call me, and tell me that if I didn't come get him, they were sending him to the ER and possibly to jail for terroristic threats. Now, again, he's 8 years old, just been bullied, just got into a fight, and is being punished for his natural fight, flight, or freeze response. Because I don't know about many of you guys, but if somebody is pushing and hitting me, I'm likely going to swing back too. Just going to put that out there, right? And then later, as time continued to progress, we, of course, got him some help, got him resettled. He moved on in his life. We had him in therapy. And somewhere around 8th grade, 9th grade, we started to have some additional kind of behavioral things happening where he had an attempt at suicide, which, of course, as a clinician and as a mom, right, my immediate response was, oh, we need to get you in to see a doc. We need to get you into intensive therapy. We need to get, right, and we need to figure out what's going on to make that happen. Well, fast forward to his junior year, there was a lot happening, right? It's junior year, there's girls, there's friends, there's, right, all the societal peer pressures and all of those things. And I think it just became overwhelming for him. And he had another attempt that actually got him hospitalized this time. Now, this is where the lack of social justice, right, and the lack of acceptance kind of showed up for me in his educational story. So he's in the hospital, right? He's missing class because he's in the hospital. He had several teachers tell him that because it was not a medical emergency, it wasn't a medical hospitalization, he could not make up the work. And because he could not make up the work from that week, he missed the AB honor roll because obviously he had zeros in the book for that week. He wasn't going to be able to make it up until the end of the semester, which of course means he doesn't make AB honor roll in his most important year that colleges look at to progress in his future. No matter how much I advocated, no matter how much I clearly pointed out that that was probably the dumbest rule I've ever heard in my life, and that it was completely discriminatory. And that I honestly, in the moment, also felt that it was a racial issue as well, right? Because I know some other children in the school who did not look like my son, who had hospitalizations where they didn't have that rule enacted. And so his whole view of school and teachers changed in that moment. Now, luckily, we got him through high school. He's now in college. He's at a four-year university and he's progressing, but he's still struggling, right? His acceptance at the collegiate level, because he's at an HBCU, is much higher, right? They actually understand the complexities and the intersectionality of his race, his gender, and his mental health concerns. But I can honestly say, I don't know if he had decided to go into a different institution, if the acceptance, the awareness, I'm sure the awareness is there, but I'm not sure if the acceptance and the social justice components would be a part of that. I hope I answered your question, Lynda.
Oh, absolutely, Lynda. And I do think you're thinking about the particular university that a child would attend. It's one that parents need to think about. I personally know where your son is, and it's a fabulous school. So I know he is in a really good setting. But larger schools, possibly, where there's so much going on, I think that's a point we need to think about.
Yeah, one of the things that I did when I went to the parent orientation was very specifically ask, right? So what is it that you all do? How do you guys address crises? If someone is depressed, if someone's having anxiety, if someone is suicidal, like what are your protocols? What does that look like? And they were able to explain in detail what they had put in place. And so I was okay with sending him there. I've been to other schools and asked that question, and they were like, we call 911, they'll go to the ER and the ER will deal with it. And I was like, no, thank you.
Very, very important points. Senator Deeds, I have followed your story for the past 10 years, and I know from what I've read that you face some significant systems challenges with your son. I'd love for you to share what you would like to about that story. And then my question to you is, personally, as a father, but then also as a legislator, do you feel that your son's mental health challenges receive the same quality of treatment and support that they would have if it had been physical health challenges?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And we have to get to a point where we understand that the brain is part of the body and mental health care is health care. We aren't at that point yet. There are a whole lot of people that the stigma that's built into our society, that's in part biblical in nature, undermines a lot of the initial desire we have to care for people that have mental illness. Yeah, I'm not sure really where to begin. You know, we have 4 perfect children, and my kids are all grown now. My oldest daughters will be 38 years old next month. My youngest daughter will be 31 in July. I had 3 girls and a boy, got a bunch of grandkids now, and I love all of them. When my son was about 21 years old, which would have been about 2010, there were just some things that were just off. And you know, we can go into as much detail about that as you want, but it doesn't really matter that much, I don't think. But by the fall of 2010, he was 21 years old. He had been diagnosed with some form of bipolar disorder. And the problem was, you know, under federal law, when children are 14, when they turn 14, parents lose a lot of the ability to control or know what's going on. And certainly when they're over 18, that you only know what they want you to know. And so he was over 18, and throughout 2011, when he was 23 or 20, he was 22 in 2011. My kids, you know, I told them all they could go anywhere they wanted to college, as long as they went to a state school in Virginia, state supported school in Virginia. So my daughters went to JMU, UVA, and Longwood. My son, who was a third child, chose William & Mary, and he was a valedictorian of his class. This kid was probably the most competent person I've ever known. He could speak any language he put his mind to learning, including Arabic and Cantonese. He could play any musical instrument he wanted to play. You know, he was a virtuoso on the clawhammer banjo and on the trombone and on the harmonica. He was just brilliant. In 2011, when he was 22, you know, his mother and I had been divorced, and he was living with me at the house, and he threatened suicide. And I went through the process of, you know, he'd stopped eating. He wasn't working. He was, you know, he just decompensated in every way, losing weight. I had him went through a TDO process, temporary detention order in Virginia. That's where one is detained and evaluated. I'll never forget visiting him in the hospital the first time. He just said, "Dad, I'm going to be fine. They just have to get my medicine straight."
My husband's giving me lunch.
The thing is, you can't.
He's at a conference, and apparently they had extra. So he's like, "What do you want?"
Please mute your microphones. Thank you.
The thing is, you know, you can't make an adult take medicine. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? So you get the medicine right. A few months later, you know, he was spent a few days in the hospital. Few months later, he decompensated again. He was threatening suicide again, and I went through the same rigmarole. Of having him TDO'd, having him hospitalized. I went to the hospital to see him. It was a hospital further away and a hospital that was more serious. He was with some seriously mentally ill people there. And I finally had a doctor who talked to me and said that Gus had was not a typical sort of bipolar person. He had a fairly heavy dose of medicine, but he would eventually be able to wean off of it. And that gave me hope. And I got Gus home, and I bargained with him. I would promise him things and he would take his medicine. I told him, I said, Gus, you either have to get a job or you have to go back to school, and I'll support you wherever you want to go to school. So he chose to go back to William and Mary. And this kid had been the valedictorian of his high school class. He was dean's list at William and Mary every semester he was there, even after he was sick, and he was still dean's list. He went over Christmas, but I could tell when he came home that first year, the spring of 2012, that he was off his medicine. And he said, Dad, it's none of your business. Dad, I'll take care of it. In the fall of 2013, interesting thing about Gus, he loved the outdoors, he loved children, he loved music. And there's this wonderful camp, this nature camp, an academic camp in the mountains of Virginia. And Gus is kind of a legend there. And he was counselor of the year the last year of his life, 2013. You look at pictures from that summer and you can tell he was detached. You could tell he wasn't right. I went and took him to supper one night that summer while he was there. And it was like he was looking over my head and laughing at visions, whatever he was seeing the whole time. I was terribly worried about him, but it's none of your business, Dad. I'm going to be all right. So we took him back to William and Mary in the fall of 2013. And a few weeks into the semester, in the meantime, my second wife's mother had died, and we had made arrangements to take her back for a funeral in Ireland, where she was from, in October of 2013. About that time, in October of 2013, Gus had a Facebook message about people trying to kill him, and how he was having a hard time in a class, which was unusual for him because he was brilliant. And I got in touch with him and I said, Gus, do you need help? Can I do anything? He said, no, I'm going to be fine, Dad. But then he said later on, next day or that night or something, he said, I want to come home. I said, Gus, I want you to be able to finish this semester if you can. And candidly, I was worried because I knew I was going to be in Ireland. Gus came home. I tricked him into going to a counselor. I said, Gus, you and I need to have some parent-child counseling. We need to have family counseling. I went to a psychologist that I know who talked to us one Saturday morning. I took Gus to an organic farm to let him do things that he loved doing with animals, and then we went to this counselor, this psychologist, and she called me later that day and said, I'm very worried. You need to get him at the community service board with us and get him before a psychiatrist right away. So I had to trick him again because he didn't want to go to the psychiatrist. He didn't want any more hospitalization. He hated that. And I tricked him into a CSB appointment. But Gus could outsmart any doctor. He could outsmart any counselor. He would go along to get along. I went to Ireland the first part of November, and with a full schedule, I had his wife, his mother, my mother, my pastor's wife, different people checking on him while I was gone. I had him scheduled to go to the CSB to a counselor. I had lots of things. He wouldn't answer my calls from Ireland. He wouldn't answer my calls till I got back about the 15th of November. I got back, and he answered my call from the airport, and it wasn't good. And I got back, and when I got back home, none of it was good. And so on the 18th of November, I had him TDO'd again. And what I met there was total complacency with how he was treated by this medical system that failed him, failed us. They sent Gus home that night because there was no bed for him, even though they determined that he was a danger to himself or others. That night, I took him home and he wouldn't talk to me. I locked my bedroom door and went to sleep because the plan was to take him to the CSB the next day. I heard him trying to get in my room that night. The next day, I got up early, I showered, I went out and fed my horses and took care of my chickens and did other things for people. I'm just a simple country guy. And Gus came across the lawn and it was kind of unusual. He had walked with purpose. And I said, "Hey, bud, how you doing?" I said, "Morning." He said, "Morning." I turned my back on him and he jumped me, stabbed me. I turned around, he stabbed me multiple times. The scars are a lot better than they used to be. Anyway, he left me all of a sudden and I walked through the field and it was hunting season at home and I had a cousin taking some hunters out to the deer stand, and he saw me stumbling through the field covered in blood and put them out, took me to his wife, who's a nurse, and they called the rescue squad. The helicopter picked me up, and the last thing I remember riding the helicopter was they talked about the second chopper coming for the second victim. I didn't know who that was. A couple days later, well, I mean, I probably did. A couple days later, when I woke up, they got that thing out of my mouth. First thing I wanted to know was Gus, and he was gone. He killed himself. We're country people. When Gus was sick, I'd taken all the guns out of the house. I'd had in the spring, I'd had bobcats at my chicken house, so I brought a couple of guns back. One gun I couldn't find any ammunition for, so I didn't have any ammunition for it. The other one was a shotgun, and when I got back from Ireland and seen notes that Gus had written, I'd taken that gun apart and put the components in different places so it couldn't be reassembled. The gun that didn't have any ammunition, Gus had gotten some ammunition, I think, from a friend, and that's what he used to kill himself. Now, the irony is, if he really wanted to kill me, he was a crackerjack shot. Not only could he play instruments and shoot and speak languages, he could hit something from a long distance with a gun, and he could have shot me very easily that morning. So I don't know whether it's just he did not get the care he deserved. He's still a beautiful child. He did not deserve to die that way.
Thank you so much, Senator Deeds.
But anyway, I guess let me finish the story, and the story will never be finished. But when I was laying in the hospital bed, I thought about the position I've got. I'm in the Senate of Virginia. I thought that I'm in a perfect position to try to make some change so that other people don't have to suffer this way. And so what I had some legislation in 2014 after he died. I've had legislation just about every year since then, but I created a joint subcommittee to study mental health because honestly, there were more questions than I had answers for. And there were questions I didn't know about. I wanted change that would make a difference. And a couple of years ago, I turned that joint subcommittee into a permanent behavioral health commission, which has full-time staff. Because I saw the process as being too personality driven. I've been in politics in Virginia for a long time. People know me, and I generally get along with people on both sides of the aisle. I've worked hard. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. I work hard to get things done. So I've had a lot of allies on both sides of the aisle in this fight, but I've tried to use the position I've been fortunate enough to have to make change, and we have made change, but we have so much more to do.
And I so appreciate your efforts, Senator Deeds. they are not unnoticed. But I certainly agree with you that we have a long way to go. I want to, do any of our panelists have follow-up comments to Senator Deed's comments?
I just want to thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Senator.
Thank you for sharing your story.
But the key thing to remember is it's not really my story. My son was a beautiful, beautiful person, and he was, as I said, he was the most competent, most brilliant person I've ever known. And I just don't want him to be remembered for the way he died. I want him to be remembered for the way he lived.
Yes, that is, I agree with you completely. That is so important. And we need to continue to improve our systems. So those stories will have longer legacies also. Kate, that does sort of lead into, you've worked in large systems and you are in a national system now. What has your experience been thinking about the policy angles of creating better services and creating equity for our children with mental health challenges, no matter where they live or what their socioeconomic or demographic, no matter what? I've heard you mention that this is a passion of yours. Can you tell us some of the things that are happening that might help?
Sure. So, and I'm new to the federal stage, but I spent a bunch of time working in Massachusetts at the state level before I came. And what I would say is there's a lot happening. There's a lot of attention being paid to developing, recognizing, and implementing services for kids. There's not enough people who are going into the work, right? I think we hear every time we talk about the sort of tragedy that the senator just talked about in his own family, and tragedies in families that are happening all over the country. We hear about this real need for more services, more people to be able to respond. I think in particular, I'm very focused on wanting to get to kids and families earlier, so that when the senator and Lynda both talked about sort of seeing things early and starting and trying to get help early, and there needs to be the availability of services early, because that's better. I like to make the comparison that we would never say to a family where their child was, had some symptoms of diabetes, come back when you have diabetes and we'll talk to you, right? That's not, we say, oh, it looks like you're beginning to have some diet. Let's do this, let's do that, let's do interventions. Let's think about all the things that are available. And I would like us to get to the point where we are doing the same for mental and behavioral health and substance use disorders, where there is real availability in schools and in the community, that the first interaction that kids have is not in an emergency department, which certainly when I was working there were a lot of kids that was their first experience with mental health treatment. Or it's not that when things have gotten so bad that they have attempted suicide, as Lynda talked about. Like, that's just, we need to be working. And I think there's a lot of focus right now on trying to do more in the community and developing systems within the community where families can get care. And the one thing that I would add is I'm a big believer in integrated care in primary care, because everybody takes their kid to the pediatrician or the primary care doc or the family medicine doc. And if those folks knew enough about behavioral health to start the ball rolling for the kids and families who show up, because that's the first person you call. you call your friend or your mom, then you call your pediatrician and say, I'm worried, right? And so I think there's a lot of attention being paid to how do we get more to happen in those places where people are comfortable, and that's where they go, and that's where they're known, and they've known their kids and themselves since they were babies. So I think those really like early, really that earlier engagement is what folks are working towards.
I would just piggyback on that, Lynda. Kate, very, very well said. I mean, it is about prevention. And I would also say that we have to expand our sort of understanding, when it comes to the drivers of health, right? I mean, we tend as a country to put, all of our sort of emphasis on this sort of disease management kind of mentality, which is very reactive as opposed to being proactive. But what the science tells us is that there's a considerable amount of drivers that aren't medical, right? I mean, how do we start looking at some of the social drivers? How do we start looking at housing and food security, racial injustice? How do we start looking at things that don't fit into a nice billable, service code? So for me, from the payer's perspective, the more we can, to your point, get upstream, right, and start to engage with people in the context of their families, in the context of their community, the more we can be intentional about helping them create their positive life trajectory, right? And then as a system and as a convener, how do we support that family on that trajectory? And it's not just about health. It'll always impact health, but it's not always.
And it's not about short-term return on investment.
That's exactly
When
why
you invest in kids, you're getting a lot of return on investment, but it may take a little while to see it, right?
I'm glad that you
Adults,
said
Kate?
that.
What's that?
I said children become adults.
As it turns out, all adults were once a child. I have been known to say that.
Amen.
But that's, I mean, just to kind of capstone that point, you're spot on again. I mean, we cannot take a quarter to quarter sort of perspective, which is, one of the reasons why, I feel CareSource is so successful in our life services work, is that we don't operate like some of the other competitors do. We're a nonprofit. And we do take a long-term lifespan view of our members and their families. It's critical.
And I just wanted to piggyback on both of them. I think one of the other kind of key aspects to this is really looking at things through the cultural lens and realizing and recognizing that, historically, marginalized communities don't necessarily have a trust for the systems that we keep wanting to push them into. You have to see a psychiatrist, you have to see a doctor, you have to see a therapist, right? But that may not be the best way to actually engage them in the work and engage them in the system. And on the physical health side, right, we've started to look at other kind of non-medical, right, like chiropractors, doulas, midwives, right? We've done that work, but we don't do that. We haven't started that yet on the behavioral health side. And I think it's important to realize and recognize that healers don't necessarily have to have a medical degree or a clinical license to actually begin healing some of the issues that we're seeing. And the more we can recognize that, the more we can get a better understanding of that, I think the more we'll be able to prevent some of the things that we're seeing. We'll be able to address some of the injustices, some of the traumas, right? Some of those key experiences that can impact mental health, substance use disorder, in children who then become adults.
And Lynda, that leads me into my next question. You and I have talked about this so many times. And when we talk about cultural issues, we're talking about cultural issues across the map. Our perspectives may be different, but as Lynda and I have talked, I'm a child of Appalachia, and our culture is very different from, say, where Kate lives. It is a culture that is somewhat closed off, and I am the granddaughter of a mountain medicine healer, so I all the things Lynda's saying really resonate for me. But Lynda, let's talk more about the prejudice and bias and discrimination that our children are facing just because of their mental health challenges. And then let's add the intersectionality of other cultural issues. How can we create a societal shift? What are your recommendations? I know you think mightily about this. What are your recommendations on this?
So what's interesting is I literally just had this conversation last week. And one of the things that I think is very clear is that in order to make a societal shift, right, it's a multi-layered approach. You have to, number one, work individually. People have to be willing to do the work, to recognize where their bias may lie and work to learn different and relate different to each other. Right. So there's got to be individual work. There's got to be community work. Where the same thing has to happen, right? There has to be acknowledgement of what has happened. There's got to be acknowledgement of feelings and experiences, but then there's got to be productive conflict resolution in order to really redefine what we want in our communities. And then the same needs to happen at the higher levels of what is it that we really want to happen? How do we redefine systems? How do we redefine community? How do we redefine policies that may be inadvertently, right, actually causing some of the stigma, the discrimination, et cetera, to happen? I once worked at the policy level, and it was always very interesting to me around how if an individual had one diagnosis of developmental disability, right, like they were not allowed to have other services around behavioral health or substance use. And I was like, well, but that policy is discriminatory. You're saying that if someone has a cognitive delay, that they can't be depressed. Like, that's not true, because as Senator Z said, the brain is part of the body, right? And so how do we really look at even the policies that we have in place from a place of equity and really modify the policies, the practices, but most importantly, in my mind, is the relationships. Healing happens in relationships. And so how do we actually have human beings look at other human beings as human beings and not the diagnosis that they may have or not the behavior that they may be exhibiting? Because I personally believe that behavior is just communication of unmet needs, right? And so how do we teach that to people and recognize that it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to ask for help instead of judging and potentially acting out of our own bias? So it's not something that's easy. I think we would love for it to just be like, I don't know about you guys, but I've seen Men in Black, right? Like they have that memory eraser. It would be great if we could just be like, everybody is now, right? Like all of their biases have gone away, but that's not true. And so it's going to take a person by person, team by team, organization by organization, community by community, county by county, state by state, right? Like federal agency by federal agency, to really kind of look at how we each contribute to the prejudice, the bias, the stigma, and the experience of children, young adults, and families as it relates to mental health and discrimination.
I love that. I mean, it's if you think about sort of a societal change, right, or sort of moving from awareness to acceptance, I think we have to start by recognizing, I'm not a very patient person, so for me, I have to practice what I preach. But we have to start by viewing acceptance, right, in this shift as a journey, right? It's a progression of evolving perspectives. we've got to remember that the word accept, right, on its own is a verb, right? It's an active process. It's one that must be practiced over and over and over again. And then you create and strengthen the neural pathways, right, in your brain. So my sort of advice to, myself, when I'm not patient, is that although I want it to happen overnight, that's not the case. And so we've got to be, focused. We've got to be patient, and we've got to remember that it's going to take everybody, sort of pitching in to turn this ship around.
Yeah, I always think about it from a place of we've got to give people the knowledge, we've got to give people the skills to do something different, but we also have to give them a change in their attitudes and their abilities if we really want to see sustainable change in any way, shape, or form. And so we've got to be thinking about it from those 4 different places in my head.
Senator Deeds, you sit in such a pivotal position for all of this conversation, because we know that not just in Virginia, but in states across the country, we have laws that really promote stigma. They promote bias and discrimination, and they are not at all family friendly or friendly to individuals who are experiencing behavioral health challenges. Help us know how to help move this forward from your perspective.
Well, you have to be in the same room that the people that make the decisions are. And you have to be able to affect the way they make those decisions. I tell people all the time that you need to get to know your legislators at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. And I don't care whether you like them, whether you vote for them, it doesn't matter. You're still making decisions that affect you. And you need to be able to sit down with them and have a conversation about what matters and why it matters, and get them to understand why they need to think about these issues so that they can be priority. Mental health is unseen by so many people, but it affects every single one of us. Something like half of us at one point in our lives will have some kind of crisis, and 1 in 5 people develop a serious mental illness. It affects every family. So we owe it to the people that struggle to figure out how to talk to people about this and how to kind of bring it out of the darkness. I think often about the developmentally disabled young man, and one I'm blanking on the book that I'm thinking about, Boo Radley. They kept him under the porch. And sometimes I worry that with mental illness and with people that face developmental challenges, that we keep them all under the porch. We don't talk about these things. We need to. Everybody, no matter what their condition, deserves to live the best life they can. And that's why we owe it to them to keep fighting. One of the things that we worked on to spend money, invest in Virginia, and we've spent about $42 million a year right now, is a permanent supportive housing. People with serious mental illness lots of times burn bridges. They don't have anywhere to go. But all the data shows that people who struggle have the best chance for long-term success if they've got some kind of stability, if they've got a place to go and they've got support when they get there. And this permanent supportive housing, the $42 million only covers about 2,400 slots a year. That's not much. That's a huge investment, but it's cheaper than hospitalization, and we're committed to it.
Senator Deeds, you mentioned quite accurately that 1 in 5 of our children are going to experience some mental health challenges. You certainly are not the only senator in Virginia who has experienced these issues. Do you find that your colleagues are willing to be open and talk about this?
They are. When I put together, and I've gotten a little criticism for this over the years. I put together this study commission in 2014, and then I reformed it by 2020, 2021 into this Behavioral Health Commission, I've insisted that its membership be made up of members of the General Assembly. I've been driven in large part by, and with the terrible shooting at Virginia Tech in 2007. Tim Kaine was the governor at that time, good friend of mine. He appointed a blue ribbon commission that came up with lots of great recommendations. Those recommendations mostly sit on a shelf gathering dust. You have to have the people that make the policy have to be invested in the responses to the problems. And that's why I've insisted that the membership of this commission be made up of solely members of the General Assembly, Democrats and Republicans, people that can come together, that can become experts experts, an overused word, I think, but they can become smart about different topics and therefore advocate for change in the General Assembly. I've worked very hard to have hard conversations with people in the General Assembly, both Democrats and Republicans, members of the Senate and the House, to try to get people to understand our mental health needs. And honestly, I think that they do come along. Maybe they don't come along as fast as I want them to. Maybe our solutions are halfway in some areas when we're doing half a loaf instead of the full loaf, but we are coming along. I'm very, you have to be optimistic in this life. I think, it's easy to be pessimistic, but I remain optimistic that we can find answers to solutions. We just have to work together. I told the members when the commission for the study mental health needs in Virginia was created, the General Assembly was controlled totally by Republicans. I'm a Democrat. They elected me chairman of the commission, the study commission, when it started, the joint subcommittee, and I've been the chair of that joint subcommittee, now the Behavioral Health Commission. And I'll tell people when they come in the door, put your Democrats and Republicans aside. This is not an issue that affects just one group of people. It affects all of us, and we owe it to those people, those families, to come up with solutions. And we will.
Yes, very, very well said. And a different issue that is so important to our audience. And Kate and Lynda, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Our children are growing up. And as Senator Deeds mentioned when he was sharing his story about his son, once our kiddos hit 18, they have the privilege of disregarding us as a part of their medical advice. They are adults. And I'm wondering how the two of you have prepared your children and worked with your children so that you can continue to be a part of their support as they get older. I know, Lynda, your son is just 18. Kate, I think you said your daughter's 23. How are you managing to continue that type of relationship so that you are aware and supportive?
Lynda, would you like to start? You want me to start?
Sure. So one of the things that I have worked really hard at with all of my children, right, is to make sure that we have open lines of communication about anything and everything, even when it's hard for me as a parent to hear it, right? Just don't put that out there. And so when he turned 18 and he went to college, he put me on his records. He put me on the account so that I could still have full access and filled out an ROI. Because for him, he considered me one of his key kind of support network folks that could actually help him in those moments. And so I've been blessed in that way that we have open dialogue, right? So while he's been in school, what I told him was he doesn't have to call me every day, but I need to talk to him once a week. And so we have a Sunday check-in. And during that process, right, like I check in on his mental health, I check in on substance use, I check in on school, I check in on girlfriends and all that other stuff, right, his friends, things of that nature. But I make it a purposeful point to really check in with him about those things, just in case he doesn't bring it up. But that was because we had a lot of conversation, right, starting at age 15 when the hospitalization happened around this and this transition point. So I think one of the things that we don't often do, right, as parents, we schedule all the appointments. We put all the appointments on calendars. We make sure they get there, but we don't necessarily teach them how to do those things and teach them how to keep the family or his support system involved. And I was intentional about doing that so that when he did transition, he knew how, and he could still include us when and if he needed to. Kate?
We had a similar approach. I would just add that, you know how if your kid is on an IEP, they say with fading support, right? Everything you're supposed to do with fading support over the course of the year, the years, et cetera. And what I would say is, in addition to kind of knowing that we were there and that the lines of communication were open, and that we would, I learned a little bit the hard way that, like, even if I talk to you more than once a week, I won't ask you about all those things more than once a week. I won't be the nagging, right, every single time I talk to you while you're at school. But the other thing that we did starting, relatively young, is actually help our kid know how to advocate for herself. And so, and this has really, this has borne out over the last 5 years of really changing from how much I need to be doing versus how much she's doing. Do you have all your support set up? Did you get, yep, check. Learned how to ask the right questions, learned how to self-advocate, learned how to say, I have these needs and it's not going to be ashamed of, it's just what I need to be successful in college. And that was really, that doesn't happen when they're adults, when they're 18, doesn't just, one day, or 14, I'm reading in the chat, that doesn't happen. But it's pretty remarkable, the difference between 18 and, going to be 23, and the change that has happened over that time, to where the amount of scaffolding around everything, the scheduling of appointments, the getting the things done, whatever the things are, has gotten lower and lower and lower, because she's able to manage more of it herself. So I think it's the combination of those things, having it there, having the lines of communication open, and also sometimes pushing to make that phone call. You hate, these kids, they hate talking on the phone. Sorry, sometimes you need to be the one to make the phone call. Mama's not going to do it for you. So some of that as well, just really finding that balance.
Those are really important points. My son and I had the same type of relationships that you're describing. And I can recall when he was getting ready to go to college and he was turning 18, me talking to him about the changes and how he would have to make decisions about where I was in his care. And he said, first of all, he didn't even know that. And secondly, he said, how on earth would I do that? I'm a kid still yet. And, I need your support. And I think that's, if we can have those conversations early, it's so critical. We know our kids are turning, and I'm seeing the chat also, Kate, that this in some places 14. Where we've lived, it's been 18, and we know those birth dates are coming up. But sometimes we maybe don't prepare for that quite as well as we should. So I'm hoping that families will take that away from today as very important conversations to be having with those children. Josh, I want to come to you now. You and I and a host of other folks have spent a lot of time talking about relational health this past 2 years. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how that fits in here, what we're talking about with relational health, and how does that intertwine with this concept of social justice?
Yeah, no, thanks, Lynda, for that question. Safety, health, and wellness are temporary at best, unless they're in the context of a healthy relationship, right? So safety, health, and wellness are built in relationships. And so, understanding that is the first gate to get through. And as a system, as a healthcare system and ecosystem, starting to shift your thought process, your perspective, your interventions, your strategy to begin solving for that. You know, I say all the time, as a managed care organization, you know, traditionally we would go and build networks of providers, which is absolutely critically important. But what's just as critically important, in my opinion, is supporting our members to build networks of people to be in their life, people that aren't necessarily paid to be in their life, right? We know that, I mean, the Surgeon General of the United States just came out in the last week or two calling, you know, isolation and loneliness as one of the single biggest threats to the U.S. healthcare system. There are major parallels, right, between relational health and social justice, particularly as it relates to assuring equity, right? Equity in our public and societal systems, the systems that so many of our loved ones, our kids, our friends, our families, ourselves are dependent upon for survival, right? So the million-dollar question that we have to ask over and over again is, how do we as a system empower families, empower our neighbors, empower our, you know, brothers and sisters of this world to dismantle these systematic inequities? How do we begin to address the disparities? You know, we appreciated the comments around, you know, individuals with disabilities. You know, up until, you know, the mid 80s to 90s, if you were born with an intellectual and developmental disability, you had two choices. You could either become a ward of the state and live in a state institution like Ron did, or you would stay home and receive no services at all. So talk about isolation and what that does to people and what that does to health cannot be overstated enough, right? So again, how do we support rather and generate our members and their families, and I'm talking from the sort of payer perspective, to develop social capital, right? How do we support people to grow their circle of support, to strengthen their community, their interconnectedness? Because we know the science is there, the bedrock science is there. There's no question about it. That relational health and that social justice and those disparities that exist today will never be addressed. We will never move the needle around happiness and health until we can recognize and start to be intentional about supporting people in that context, right? So no level of human health, well-being, or dignity can last or be sustained without the context of the relationships that we all live with and live together, right? As one community, one connected community. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it's a great answer, Josh, and you're correct. I saw that same report. We knew this through the pandemic, and unfortunately it continues. People are lonely, and it certainly is becoming a public health crisis. I'm going to try to get another question in here, and I hope everyone has noticed that we have a wide range of perspectives here with this panel today. And that was purposeful because we wanted to try to address some of these issues about the challenges our families are facing from a wide variety of perspectives. But I'm going to ask our panel now, what would our culture look like? And we know this takes time, but if our children were accepted, they didn't face this bias and prejudice about their behavioral health challenges, how would communities, policies, systems, the media, how would things begin to evolve? And the footnote to that is, what recommendations do you have for our audience to try to begin to move towards that type of evolution? And Senator Deeds, I think I'd like to start with you. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. I that's a big question. First I wanted just some advice for people with kids that are over 18. As you ought to, your children don't stop being your children just because they turn the majority. You just have to find a different way to take care of them. If they're in a lucid moment, make sure you get them to sign a power of attorney. Make sure you get them to sign a medical power of attorney. Do whatever you have to get them to help you be involved in their decision making. The alternative in Virginia is to have to file suit against them and to become a committee or a guardian, and that just sets up an adverse situation that sometimes exacerbates your own safety, your situation. We need to get to the point where mental health is truly part of the healthcare discussion. There's been some discussion that about diabetes. Certainly we don't make people with diabetes or symptoms of diabetes wait for care. We don't also make fun of people with breast cancer. We don't laugh and joke about people with heart disease. Sometimes we've got to be very careful about the language we use. Cray, talk about people that are crazy. I had a woman that came into my office a few years ago that wanted to talk about the other N word. Nuts. People that we talk about other people, human beings that are entitled to respect and dignity, even when they have a mental health condition. We have to be a more open, inclusive society, and we can't. The last couple of years, our politics have been so infected by people that are afraid of wokeness, whatever that means. They're so afraid of critical race theory. They're all this stuff is thrown in the way of us becoming one people, of us understanding where the other person is, and we have to be open to understanding people who have different abilities too. Everybody's entitled to live the best life they can, no matter what their abilities. And that includes people that have struggled with mental illness, includes people with developmental disabilities, it includes all people. We have a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much. Kate, same question to you. Thinking about this utopian society that I have been trying to create my entire career.
Same, Linda, same. Oh, goodness. What would it look like? I mean, what it would look like from I'm thinking about it from a healthcare perspective, it would be just as easy to get an appointment with a therapist or a psychiatrist as it is to get an appointment with the pediatrician, if that's who you need to know, or the endocrinologist or whomever, right? So I think from the healthcare perspective, it would just there would be a level playing field around mental health. When I was an advocate, we used to talk about the entals, dental and mental, both hard to access, right? Like the head is actually attached to the body, going back to where we started. And so it would be good if people could get the care that they needed to keep themselves healthy in all of the ways. But I also think there's a language issue, whether it's the other N word that you just referenced, Senator, but there is a language issue around sort of the language that is acceptable, that people use, that they don't think about, that I think we would know that things had changed if people were not using othering language to describe kids with mental health issues, adults with mental health issues, et cetera. I have actually enjoyed wearing my ribbon last week and this week and I've actually been out in the world a whole bunch, which I'm not always because I work from home. Because I like when people ask me, they say, what is that thing? And I say, well, what is it for? Like, why are you wearing, even on Zoom, actually, people are asking me, I'm in these big meetings, what is that green ribbon for? I said, well, let me tell it, let's talk about this, right? Taking every opportunity to actually just openly talk this sort of getting back to where we started, which was about acceptance. Just the fact that you could talk about this like you talk about anything else, right? So I think we would know we were there if it were just not an issue. But again, I would agree with the senator. We got a long way to go. We got a lot of hard work to do. And I also agree it doesn't have to do with party, or it doesn't have to do with like where you're at, your geography, et cetera. This is something that is everyone needs to be taking part in. I just want to add one other thing, which is like, I do have hope when I had the luxury, I don't know if Pam Sager is still here from Palin, Massachusetts, but I had the luxury of meeting with a group of young people, young adults, who are sort of peer mentors for their chapter. Because I wanted to talk about Medicaid unwinding, which y'all may have heard of, language. And those kids rocked, right? These are all kids who have mental health issues, and they came and they spent an hour with me and we talked. And I brought that information to the Office of Communications, right? And they are using that language. Kids have so much to offer to all of us and to show all of us, and the way that they talk and the way that they think and so I think I have tremendous hope when I engage with a group of young people or even a single young person, because it's different, right? And I feel like generationally, my generation is certainly different than my parents' generation. So maybe, although it feels like it's very slow, maybe it's happening. So.
Great. And I love othering language. I will now shamelessly steal that word. So you will hear me using it.
It's not mine, and you're welcome to it. But it really is. It's just other, it's the opposite of what we want.
I like that very much. Lynda, all the conversations we've had about this, can you sum this up in a few words?
It's like that. I mean, ultimately, I think what our culture would look like is, no matter where someone goes, what system they're in, who they're talking to, or who they are engaging with, there would be relationships built, open communication, and assistance provided when needed, right? And so that assistance would be open, it would be clear, it would be person-driven, it would be culturally relevant for them, but it would be not from a place of judgment, not from a place of prejudice, not from a place of bias, right? But from a place of empathy and a place of support and a place of relationship, right? Like, I think that's one of the key things that we all just really need to understand, is that healing happens in relationships. And so for me, the society, right, looks like all of us trying to be in relationship with each other and understanding that we are all here together, just trying to get along, right? And whatever's thrown our way, the best thing that we can do is support each other instead of judge each other, support each other instead of label each other, right? Support each other instead of othering each other. Yeah, I love that word, right? And so I think, like I said earlier, it's really about, number one, having open minds. Number two, understanding that though we talk about relationship, can we just all admit that not everybody was taught how to be and stay in relationships growing up, right? So sometimes just because someone is older doesn't mean that they necessarily know what it means to be in a relationship. And so that's going to take some teaching. That's going to take some experiential work. But it's something that we can do. And I'm super excited to continue to be in the fight, but to also work with all of the youth and young adults and the children coming up, to teach them now how to be in relationships so that as they become adults, right, they have the skills that they need to communicate. They have the skills that they need to advocate. They have the skills that they need to problem solve. They have the skills that they need to say, I need help. Can somebody help me? Instead of feeling like they have to be quiet because somebody may judge them.
And Lynda, you make a strong argument for peer support.
I do, everywhere I go.
Which we all believe is so important. Josh, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, first of all, fellow panelists, you guys are just inspiring me. For me, utopia is when we stop defining people by their diagnosis and start defining people by their dreams, right? So, introducing Ron is not somebody with a disability, but an artist who is thriving in his community, as a brother or a sister or a friend or whatever. For me, it's utopia is going to be when we move from sort of mental health awareness to acceptance to a place when actually it's a celebration because we've actually done it. And so, a perfect world is we all come back together as a group and we can celebrate. But that doesn't mean that we can't celebrate the small wins along the way.
Well, I want to thank my panel. This has just been amazing. And here's what I promise you. I'm not just staying for the fight. I'm staying for the victory. And I hope each and every one of you will do the same. Thanks to all of you who joined us today. This will be posted on the Federation website as soon as my hardworking staff can get that done. Please share it widely. Senator Deeds, Lynda, Kate, Josh, thank you so much for sharing your stories, for sharing your journeys, and for sharing some recommendations for how we can get to the victory. Everyone have a great day, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone.
Take care.
Lynda, thank you for putting this together. This was very powerful and very encouraging. Thank you.